Hey, good afternoon. Scott Luton with you here on Supply Chain Now. Welcome to today's webinar. So, on today's program, we're going to be featuring two business leaders that are going to offer timely insights and expertise on the post-pandemic environment, right? Especially from a supply chain standpoint. We've heard a lot of questions and concerns from practitioners across the globe. So, stay tuned for what should be a very informative discussion that will raise your supply chain IQ. Quick programming note before we get started. If you enjoy our webinar today, be sure to check out our podcast. You can find us and subscribe wherever you get your podcast from. All right, so with that said, let's tackle our ground rules, which are pretty simple. First up, all attendees will be on mute as we're looking to optimize the audio experience. Now, with that said, we want to make it as interactive as possible. So during Q&A, please do submit your questions via the chat toolbar. We'll answer as many as we have time for at the conclusion. You can also raise your hand. You'll click on the raise your hand button if you've got a good microphone internet connection. That will allow you to pose your question or comments verbally. And finally, a recording of the session will be available in the next few days to each of our registrants. All right, so now with no further ado, let's welcome in our featured panelists here today. First, let's welcome Kelly Barner to today's show. Kelly is owner of Buyers Meeting Point and has a very unique perspective, especially on procurement, thanks to her 15 plus years as a practitioner. A prolific writer, Kelly is sought after for her insights and expertise across the industry. In 2016, she was appointed to become the Business Survey Chair for the ISM New York Report on Business. Kelly has also co-authored 3 books, including Finance Unleashed, Leveraging the CFO for Innovation. We are going to be unleashing Kelly's point of view today for sure. Next up, I want to welcome in Rod Shurkin to today's show. Rod is founder and president of ProPurchaser.com, a trusted resource that has grown to serve thousands of procurement professionals since 2001. Prior to leading ProPurchaser.com, Rod spent 15 years as a senior executive responsible for supply chain for both Pillsbury and Ball Packaging. So since leaving industry, Rod has spent the last couple of decades passionately sharing his expertise and perspective with supply chain professionals around the world. In fact, you may have heard and enjoyed Rod's perspective on previous Supply Chain Now podcasts. All right, with no further ado, please join me in welcoming Kelly Barner.
Thank you so much, Scott, and good morning. Thank you to everybody that has joined us. I'm so glad that you're going to be with us today. Here's a very high level of what we're going to go through. As promised, we recognize we're at a very unique moment in time from a business perspective. So we're going to start by looking at some of the supply chain best practices. I'm giving you air quotes, webinar air quotes. The practices that we've all known and loved and relied upon for years and years that maybe need a fresh set of eyes in the context of the pandemic. And then we're going to move on and look at some of your options for cost containment and supply chain professional resilience to see what, in fact, your options are. Before, as Scott said, please do type those questions into the chat box. We absolutely welcome any thoughts or questions that you have, and so we'll reserve some time at the end for Q&A. So if we go to our very first slide of content here, hopefully these 4 things are very familiar to everybody that's with us today. Just-in-time inventory management, extended supply chains, supplier rationalization, and low-cost supply and service management. These are the things that we're going to talk through, all in the context of change. And so if I can sort of set the stage for you on these 4, I'll share a very quick personal story. Like many of you, I have kids and we're all waiting with bated breath, right, to find out what's happening with schools, what's the plan going to be. And every time we get a little bit of news, I sit them down and I say, okay, guys, here's the piece of news we got today. And almost inevitably, one of the 3 looks at me and says, is this good news or bad news? And I've gotten into the habit of saying to them, it's just news, right? At this point, I think there is so much change, some of it due to the pandemic, but some of it due to ongoing conditions. We all just need to adjust to change, sometimes abrupt change, as a regular part of our environment going forward. So change is inevitable, but we have lots of options, and that's what we're going to spend the next hour talking about. So if I could have the next slide, we're going to start by talking about just-in-time inventory management. And a lot of what I'm going to pull is actually from recent news stories. If you're interested in reading any of these, my email will be at the end. Please don't hesitate to reach out. But basically what Dave Blanchard is saying in this quote here is that we're currently asking an awful lot of a supply chain that was already stretched. So we had already figured out little ways to cut corners and little ways to stretch things, little ways to manage time, just looking for that tiny edge. And every one of those little ways and every one of those little edges had a trade-off decision at the time. And what we're finding out now is that under some circumstances, like where we are today, all of those little costs sometimes add up into one big oppressive thing that we have to handle. So if I could have the next slide, let's look at just-in-time inventory management sort of from an optimization standpoint. So any of these strategies, and let me also stress, none of them is bad, right? In and of themselves, it's like change. It's not good change, it's not bad change, it's change. All of these strategies, they're not good, they're not bad. We're not saying they're expiring, but they need a fresh look because we now are emphasizing different things. We can assume different things. There are different requirements of us from the business and from the world at large, and we need to be thinking about some new challenges we've discovered. So especially in terms of just-in-time inventory management, this has created an opportunity for businesses to minimize their cash outlay because we knew, again to my webinar air quotes, we knew that we could get those parts, we could get those service providers reliably at a predictable price with minimal delay. And now we no longer know that, right? If you think about any one of us that maybe over the last 2 or 3 months had a moment that you were really nervous about whether or not you were actually going to run out of toilet paper, right? This was a very real concern for many people, you know, with all of the hoarding and everything going on. You know, in the past, we've kind of managed the toilet paper thing as a just-in-time. There's only so much space in that little cabinet under the bathroom sink or maybe in the linen closet. So, you know, you have a few rolls here and there. Well, now we're all, oh my gosh, I have, you know, 4 wholesale club packs, and if I see a 5th, I might buy it. And that's fine for us on a personal level. But when we think about it from an enterprise standpoint, we start to run into challenges because we don't have the space and we don't necessarily have the capital to invest in all of that inventory. So if we can no longer predictably get these goods and services, we need to have a plan B. So what's going to happen if those materials don't make it in time? What's going to happen if they do make it in time, but there's a quality issue and we need to send something back? Just in time isn't necessarily going to go away, but we are probably going to select it as a strategy for a different subset of goods and services. And we are going to do more due diligence around pre-qualifying alternate sources, maybe having more suppliers for a given good or service, maybe keeping a little more safety stock on hand, or moving those order triggers sooner so that we're not running it quite so lean. There are some changes that we're going to need to make to the assumptions that are part of this just-in-time inventory management. Now, our next supply chain best practice is looking at extended supply chains. And this is actually funny given the challenges we're talking about. We have a quote here from Dream McClinton, actual name. I think this quote is particularly relevant because it looks at sort of the very top line CEO's perspective on what's going on with our supply chains and what it means for the business. So what he's saying here is that more than half of manufacturers are looking to source domestically because of some of the worries we've seen in supply chain. And then over 2/3 are looking into reshoring. Now, if we're being realists, right? We know some of this is reactionary. Not everything is going to be reshored. Not everything is going to be sourced domestically. But because there are assumptions that go into anything that we're sourcing from an extended supply chain perspective, right now is a great moment to revisit those assumptions and look at our options and reconsider some of the cost and benefit trade-offs. So if we look at the next slide, I've kind of broken this down along similar lines to how we looked at just-in-time inventory management. And the big question here is, how is your supply chain extended? Is your supply chain extended because there are a lot of links in the chain or stops between a raw material and when a usable part or component gets to you? Or is your supply chain extended, even if it's only one link in the chain? Maybe you're pulling from, a geographically dispersed network. Are you sourcing directly from China, right? You've got delays embedded in there. It's got to go a long way before it can get to you. And why did you choose to follow this strategy in the past? So in order to work, extended supply chains require open trade, right? Minimal concerns about tariffs, smooth sailing, highly predictable demand and consumer preferences. I mean, you could almost take a red pen and draw a line through all those things, because all of them have either been eliminated, wiped out, greatly changed, or just simply brought into question over the last 3-4 months. And once we can no longer count on those things, it changes the way we look at the benefit of pulling from extended supply chains. Now, the next practice that we're going to look at is supplier rationalization. Now, my background, as Scott mentioned, is in procurement, so supplier rationalization is one of those things we discuss all the time. If it's terminology that doesn't happen to be part of your practice, or if you're more on the traditional supply chain side of things, this is sort of the nice word for looking at your supply base and making sure that you have only as many suppliers as you need. Because the more concentrated you can make your spend among a smaller group of suppliers, the better pricing leverage you have, the more time you can spend managing relationships with each of your key or strategic suppliers. And there's sort of this rough goal of having 20% of your suppliers representing 80% of your spend, sort of that loose Pareto that we tend to bring into this. Now, on a sourcing project level, a lot of times this means that in the past, in order to drive out costs, we have taken a category that has 4 or 5 suppliers, and we've said, hey, what'll it do to our prices and options if we bring down that to 1 or 2 suppliers, right? Maybe we're deliberately sole sourcing because there's an advantage to buying all of a given part or service from one supplier. Now, again, in the context of risk, right, disruption is the big word. So these are numbers pulling from brand new Hackett Group research, basically saying that, companies are looking into the tier 2 and tier 3. So if my direct suppliers are tier 1, those suppliers are my tier 2. And I have a responsibility to know what's going on at that level. And if I'm really dependent on a given supplier, I may even need to understand what their risk management practices are, because if they're not doing a good job managing risk, it's going to affect me. So let's break this down like we've done with some of the others and take a look at some of the assumptions that we have to make. Now, one of the things about what we're emphasizing with supplier rationalization is that we are emphasizing our ability to, once again, predictably, we need like a bell, anything that you need to be predictable, seriously start questioning it if you haven't already. You need to be able to predictably get supply from those suppliers. And it does assume that there are suppliers in the market that can satisfy your demand on their own. Usually that works best in markets that have large existing suppliers that have available operational efficiencies so that they can pass along cost advantages. Now, what happens if you've sole sourced with a supplier, right? Here's a procurement nightmare. You've sole sourced and that supplier shuts down their factory, right? Goes out of business. and you don't have anybody else where you've committed volume that you can turn to and say, can you help me out? Can you provide me with more than I had told you I was going to buy? Now you're in a situation where potentially in the face of a pandemic, you're trying to find new suppliers and get people to pick up the phone. That's kind of a scary place to be, right? So the other thing about this, I think, and this is another one of those assumptions that we've had to deal with, is that when we deliberately say we're not going to sole source, we're going to have 2 suppliers, we're going to have 3, because we want to make sure there's some built-in security to the way we're managing this category, you're assuming that those 2 or 3 suppliers don't share the same supply chain. And both because it's entertaining, and I think because it's so familiar to everybody. I'm going to go back to my toilet paper example. You know, I could say, oh, me personally, my household, we have a very distributed toilet paper supply chain. I can go to this supermarket. I can go to Home Depot. I can go to a convenience store. I can go to CVS or Walgreens. However, every single one of those sources at some point is probably dependent upon, say, a Kimberly-Clark to have all of their warehouses open, all of their supply chains moving. If the problem is further up in the chain, I actually haven't differentiated my supply chain at all. I've just hidden the problem, buried it 2 or 3 tiers away from me so that I can't see it. I have less notice there's a disruption coming, and there's a heck of a lot less I can do about it. And so we really do need to understand what we're choosing to do when we look at rationalizing a category. And for any of those categories where we really rationalize ourselves down to potentially 1 supplier, we do need to revisit and make sure that, again, there is some kind of plan B there. Now, for my last supply chain best practice, we're going to look at, low-cost sourcing. So this is really where we start to think about a commoditized product or service, where you as a company or as a team are saying, you know what, everything here is exactly the same. As long as it shows up and it checks all the boxes, doesn't make any difference to us. So you've made your decision, your contract, your awards, your suppliers in the past, strictly based on cost. It does work for both goods and services, as you're going to see in just a minute. And not only do you want to think about whether cost is still a valid decision basis, you're going to want to revisit some of these categories because they are no longer commoditized services. So if I can get my next slide, I'm going to actually take you through what I think is a fantastic illustration of how, in fact, commoditized products and services may no longer be. A great example of a service that a lot of commercial facilities have thought about as commoditized in the past is janitorial, right? Somebody needs to sweep, somebody needs to wash windows, wipe down surfaces. I mean, there was always a specification that went along with it. It's not to say that a commoditized service is willy-nilly, right? It has standardized specs. There's nothing custom. It's, in this case, I'm talking about operational distance from your end customer, meaning if you are producing something, as long as your facility is clean enough to keep operating, it does not affect your customer's decision to buy your product or not about, how clean the factory floor was. As long as there's no safety issues, there's no product quality issues, it's distant from them. So you're not making a strategic decision when you pick a janitorial service. But that is in the days before the global pandemic, right? Now, not only are janitorial services highly strategic, there's a difference in the capabilities that each one of these providers has, right? Now there's not only their ability to secure the proper chemicals, there's different kinds of protocols that have to be followed. You may have to be inspected more often by a local regulatory authority, and you need to meet a higher level of spec. The other thing that it affects, when you think back to that idea of operational distance, is both in terms of customers and more directly in terms of employees. Janitorial services might be the decision-making factor between whether you can fully staff a shift or not. If your employees do not feel safe in your facility because they think there's something lacking or absent or careless about those janitorial services, they're not coming in. They may go get a job someplace else. Now, janitorial services that were, okay before and met the requirements, they are now making the difference between you being able to fulfill an order or not. You've closed that operational distance, and it's now a strategic decision-making factor on the part of your workforce. So what it really comes down to, and I know I've run through a lot very quickly, it really goes back to that idea of accepting change and thinking very carefully about the assumptions we make before analysis and optimization, and thinking very carefully about what we assume, what we perceive, right? Because the fact of the matter is, the more we all accept the fact that change is part of our reality, the more we need to be wary of anybody that tells us they have too much certainty. So for instance, if somebody right now, August 19th, tells you that they have all the answers, even 30 days out, do not walk, run. That person is working on a false sense of confidence, right? And you need to be careful about any assumptions that are being baked into their argument. We always need to be able to re-examine and give ourselves as much cost-effective optionality as we can. So as I transition myself now over, I'm going to give the floor to Rod. He's going to take a look at, we've talked through some of the options and issues with these best practices. He's going to actually tell you what some of your options are for continuing to manage and contain costs while also making sure that you have what you need to keep your operation running.
Thanks, Kelly. That's great. Hi, everyone. I'm Rod Shirkin. I'm going to talk about, as Kelly said, how to both contain costs and boost supply chain resilience at the same time. And as Kelly has just so clearly explained, many of us have had to learn the hard way that extended supply chains are vulnerable to disruption. And this vulnerability, this lack of resilience, is a natural consequence of physical stretching and a quest for lower prices again. And the desire to drive out costs also caused many companies to opt for just-in-time logistics, which by definition have also reduced inventory buffers. So on the surface, the twin goals of building supply chain resilience, building a supply chain that's both competitive and resilient looks like it's incompatible. And because the lowest cost suppliers are typically located far away, and abandoning just-in-time logistic means adding costs of capital. But that's, what we're hoping to do. The goal of this webinar is to present ideas that can help you build supply chains that are simultaneously resilient and low cost. And we hope at the end you're pleasantly surprised at how effective you can become at driving costs lower and career prospects higher, no matter how the future actually unfolds. So the way we attack this is through something we call at ProPurchaser anyway, cost transparency. And the basis of cost transparency are four cornerstones of something we call big picture procurement. Next slide, please. The four cornerstones are the golden rule of negotiations, and we'll talk a bit about that. The second was should cost modeling, which is really an extension of the golden rule. It's really the first two cornerstones talk about cost transparency, how to create cost transparency. And then the third and fourth cornerstones, the converting sales reps into advocates, and then working creatively with your preferred suppliers on joint projects. Those are kind of harvesting the fruits of the labor of the transparency. So the first two focus on creating transparency, and the second two focus on what to do with that transparency. Next slide, please. So the golden rule, never enter a negotiation without first researching what's happened to your supplier's costs. You'll hear that a few times. Next slide, please. And here's some examples of how that works. Here's cold rolled steel, and many of us are familiar with it. Here's a 3-year chart. You can see that cold rolled steel back in 2017 was about $850 a ton. It peaked to about $1,000 a ton. This is in 2018 when the tariffs were imposed. So anybody who bought things made from steel, fasteners, components, etc., would probably have gotten 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 cost increases during the period in early 2018. But since then, the cost, as you can see, has fallen quite dramatically. In fact, today the cost is quite a bit lower than it was back 3 years ago. Next slide, please. So this is what we mean by big picture. You're looking back in time at the big picture of what's happened to your supplier's costs. And what you're really looking for are things we call silent slopes. And silent slopes are really easy to spot. Show you how in a second. But what would have happened in the case here, let's say you buy a fastener, you buy a bolt, a big bolt for 41 cents, and that's what you paid back in 2017. And then the price of the bolt went to about 44.5 cents. That's because the price of steel went up, and you would have gotten quite legitimately a request from your supplier for an increase in the price of the bolt because their raw material costs had clearly gone up, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's totally correct. We all have to make sure our suppliers remain profitable, and when their costs go up, it's only right that we take an increase. Next slide, please. But what happens with a silent slope is that there's this tendency to only tell us when their costs go up. Suppliers will tell you when the costs go up because they want to increase the price, and quite rightly, as I just mentioned, but it's not in their interest to tell us when their costs go down. It's because they, of course, have to lower the price, and we're all in business to make all the money we can. It's not a bad thing. It's just the way our system works. So we can't expect our suppliers to tell us when our costs go down. Next slide, please. And that's why we call this part of the graph a silent slope, because we hear about it on the upside and we don't hear about it on the downside. Next slide, please. So what we have is something called price creep, and we're all familiar with that. And this is, if we're not watching, and we'll talk about how to watch, but if you're not paying much attention, especially something like a bolt, a C-class item, even a B-class item, it's very easy for silent slopes to kind of appear. And when the silent slopes appear, you're going to have price creep, because really the price today, the steel's about $700 a ton, a lot less than it was even back 3 years ago. We should be paying something less than 41 cents. But if you're not watching, you're going to have price creep and pay 44. Next slide, please. And silent slopes are everywhere. This is the same steel graph, except we've gone back to 2014. So there was a silent slope in 2015. And again, there was a legitimate increase in 2018, as we discussed, and then a silent slope as we're in there. So price creep is everywhere. Next slide, please. This is some, the random commodities. The reason we track commodities is because commodities are the main raw materials that our suppliers use to produce the components that we buy. So, aluminum, lots of room for silent slope. Softwood lumber. Now, as you know, softwood lumber recently has shot back up again. So with the pandemic, there's a lot of home renovation going on. But you can see there was a silent slope back a couple of years ago. High density polyethylene isn't just, metals. There's high density, a lot of plastics. There's been two, actually one extended silent slope. My goodness, the price today is half of what it was 2 or 3 years ago. And even crude oil fluctuates. So wherever there's fluctuation, and fluctuation in almost all commodities, when things are going up and down, then there's room for silent slopes. And once you've got silent slopes, you've got price creep. Next slide, please, Amanda. So cost transparency, looking back at the big picture, favors the buyer because it eliminates price creep. And it also lets the data do the talking. It's a lot less confrontational when you present a graph to a sales rep and saying, look, why are you still charging me 44 cents for that bolt when you should be charging me, from what I can see, less than 41. So it eliminates price creep, and it also does it in a way that lets the data do the talking. Next slide, please. But creating cost transparency is your responsibility. You're, procurement professionals. We can't expect our suppliers to tell us when the costs go down, because it's not, as I mentioned, it's not in their interest. Nobody wants to lower their prices voluntarily, so it's our job to make sure that we keep those costs in front of our suppliers. They know that we're watching, and we're looking at the big picture. We're always looking back and making sure that all factors are being considered. Next slide, please. And big picture procurement positions you to manage costs effectively in writing with no need to meet in person. This is where kind of the COVID thing comes in. We've always advocated that it's best to do your price negotiation in writing because it makes it more objective and less emotional, less stressful. But now it's almost become, mandatory, because if you can make your argument in writing, show your supplier, your sales rep a silent slope, do it in writing, you can usually come to a price agreement without actually having to meet in person. So next slide, please. So remember the golden rule: never enter negotiation without first researching what's happened to suppliers' costs. Next slide, please. So that was the first cornerstone, the golden rule. The second one was should cost modeling. And as I mentioned, they're both have to do with transparency, making your supplier's cost transparent. So it's, sometimes something's not as simple as a bolt where it's made out of steel. Sometimes you need things that are made out of 2 or more different cost drivers. So we'll talk about how to do that. And the way to do that was with a very simple should cost modeling techniques that I'll show you now. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So this is a simple Excel spreadsheet. We're looking at full truckload rate. There's really 2 inputs. There are more than 2 in real life, but the 2 major inputs for modeling trucking would be the fuel, the diesel, and the cost of the driver. Take a spreadsheet, put the 2 inputs here, estimate roughly what you think the percentage is of the cost. So if it costs $1 to run a tractor trailer for a mile, then we're estimating the diesel would be 25 cents, and the driver's labor is 25 cents. And again, this is you never get modeling right the first time. In fact, there's a handout called "You Never Get It Right the First Time," and I'll show it to you in a minute. But there's a rule when you're should cost modeling: you don't worry about getting it right the first time. Think of it as a discussion piece, something you're going to show the supplier and get his or her input. In fact, that's a really important part of the process. You don't want to impose a model. You want to get consensus, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute. So we've estimated 25% for each. We look at the price 12 months ago, so we're about to sit down and renegotiate the price of let's say the truckload that we moved from the plant to the warehouse, and we paid $1,000 for it last year, and we're about to sit down and renegotiate with the trucker. The price of diesel last year was $2.19. The price of it today is about 96 cents. Unit labor costs index was 117 back last year, and now it's 122. So the diesel's down dramatically, and the labor's up 4%. So we do the math. We take 25% of 56%, the difference, so that's 14%. So just based on the diesel alone, we should get a 14% discount. So $140 basically off the $1,000 truckload. And based on what's happened to the price of labor, we should be paying slightly more. So 4% change, it's a quarter, it's 25% of the total cost. So we should pay $10 more, another 1%. So the net result is a 13% decrease. So going into a negotiation, you show your sales rep this, you say, or even before the negotiation, it doesn't really matter. You can send them the spreadsheet and say, based on our analysis, we would expect to pay $870 for that load. Next slide, please. Now your supplier is going to come back and he's going to correct the model. He or she will correct the model, which is good, because as I said, you want them to correct it. The reason you want them to correct it is because once they correct it, they own it too, and it becomes something you can't disagree on. Once the supplier's had a chance to make the changes, then you're both singing from the same song sheet. And a lot of the acrimony, a lot of the confrontation that goes into price negotiations just goes away. So in this case, simple case, the supplier comes back and says, look, the diesel isn't 25%, it's only 20, and the labor isn't 25, it's 40%. There's a shortage of truck drivers, which is true, and these are the right numbers. So the math doesn't change. The prices haven't changed, so that 20% of 56 becomes 11, and 40% of the 4% becomes 1.6. So instead of a 13% decrease, it's a 9.7 or a 10% decrease. So what's happened here is you've basically, put a discussion piece model out to the suppliers. Suppliers come back and corrected it, and now you have something you can both agree on. Next slide, please. So that's a very simple example using a should cost model. This is from Pro Purchaser. A lot of things are more complicated than just 2 inputs, like like trucking is. So I'll take you through this quickly. This is a mid-sized electric motor made in North America. The start date, this is going to create a stacked bar chart, a little that's going to start whenever you want it to. So we're telling it to start 2018. Normally the start date is the last time you negotiated something, or maybe 2 cycles ago. So let's say we negotiate this every January. And the price I paid on the start date was $210 for this motor. And so I use, what I've decided is there are 3 main cost drivers. There's cold rolled steel. There's a lot of cold rolled steel in the motor, the housing, the fasteners, etc. Clearly there's copper. There's a copper around the winding, the armature. And there's grain oriented electrical steel, which is the heart of an electric motor, the armature. Now, there are more parts to an electric motor. There are brushes, other things. But that's another key with when you build a should cost model, you don't have to get it all right. First of all, you want the supplier to come back, and if there's something serious missing, something significant missing, they're going to correct it, which is a good thing. And there's no use, getting too detailed, because you never really get a model right. You can't really ever know, for example, which your supplier's profits, overheads, and margins are. So what you really want a model to do is be directional. You want it to say, should I be paying more, or should I be paying less? Should I be paying 10% more or 2% more? And that's what a model like this does. So don't get too fussed with accuracy, and don't get too fussed with high accuracy, and don't get too fussed with getting all the individual components in there, because it really isn't that relevant. I'll show you why in a minute. Next slide, please. So I take these 3 inputs, cold rolled steel, and I know back on the start date it was $800, $805 a ton, and I estimate there's $25 worth of steel in a motor. I can take the motor, I can weigh the housing, there's lots of ways to do it. But again, that might be $20, it might be $30. It doesn't really matter, because it's a discussion piece, and you're just going to get it directionally correct. Copper, $202.49 a pound. I reckon there's $35 worth of copper and $45 worth of grain-oriented steel. And those 3 numbers add up to 105, and the total is 210, so that leaves 105. So that means whatever's left must be the supplier's profits, overheads, and unknowns. Some people call that gross margin. So in this case, about half of what you're paying for is what the supplier pays for those materials, and the other half is what you're paying to cover the overheads and make a profit. Next slide, please. So you run it through the math, and I'll explain how the math works in a minute. So there's the $210 on the start date. Remember, that was in 2018. And what this model says, that based on 2 years later, that same $210 motor should be $202, or there should be a 3.5% decrease in the price of the motor. And the way the math works is simple. This blue bar at the bottom is the gross margin, is that $105 the supplier needed to cover his overheads, and we hold that constant over time. What we're really saying to suppliers, look, we know you need to make a profit. We need to, you need to cover your overheads. We want you to, and we respect it. And if they, for example, do things to reduce their overhead, let's say they add a 3rd shift, or they invest in capital equipment that reduces, improves productivity, we're saying that's for your account. We don't want that. All we really want is for the price to go up and down with the raw materials and direct costs that you put in. So as copper prices change, as electrical steel prices change, as cold rolled steel prices change, we expect you to adjust your prices, but your margin is sacred. We respect that, it's yours. So you could then send this to yours, just like with the trucking example, you would, send this to your sales rep and say, look, this our calculation is about $202 for that motor. And please, next slide, please. And of course, the supplier will come back and say, well, actually, there's, not quite right. You said $35 for the copper, it's really $48. You said $45 for the grain-oriented steel. Actually, it's only $35, but you forgot labor, you forgot trucking. And oh, by the way, we don't use cold rolled steel, we use stainless steel. For corrosion reasons, it's not $25 worth of steel, it's $40. And our gross margin isn't 105, we wish it was. It's only 63, but of course the total's 210. So you basically got a much better model now than you did before. Excuse me, and as I mentioned, more importantly, you've got something that you both agree to. So please, next slide, please. So if you run these numbers, there's the $63 at the bottom. Those are all the components that the supplier and you put together. There's the $210 price on the start date. It's $205 now. So instead of a 3.5, excuse me, I'm just going to get a glass of water here. Sorry about that. So instead of a 3.5% decrease, it's a 2% decrease. So what's just happened? You've created a model, you've shown it to your supplier, it was your best estimate, it was a discussion piece, they've come back and corrected it. You now have something that you can both agree on. Secondly, it's also something that's kind of an automatic pilot, because every month now, as the price of the direct materials changes, there'll be a new bar in this graph, but you don't really have to adjust the graph every month because the actual ratios were set up on the start date. So this kind of goes on automatic pilot. You can use this as a mechanism, a pricing mechanism. So a year from now, you could look back and say, oh, it's $217 or it's $222, and the hassle, the confrontation that often occurs when you negotiate pricing kind of goes away, because your supplier is part of the process to make this happen. A lot of people use this as an automatic pricing mechanism, especially when both parties agree. Next slide, please. The other thing, looking at COVID, is a lot of people say, well, what about COVID? Yeah, I've just got a 5% increase or 10% or 15% increase for my sales rep, saying, look, we've incurred more expenses. We've got to, as Kelly was saying, our sanitation costs have gone up. We've got personal protection now for our workers. But remember that when you have a model like this, the COVID mainly affects the overhead. So if there's been a 5% increase, let's say they have extra sanitation, let's say they're spending $20 a day per employee on PPE, that will affect the 63%. So that's roughly 30% of the total. So there could be a 5 or 10% increase, but not on the copper, not on the grade oriented steel, not on the trucking. So with a model like this, you can realistically ascertain the effects that COVID should have. And I think in many cases, the effects of COVID are not financially as dramatic as some of our sales reps might make us think. So, a 5 or 10% increase here is more like a 2 or 3% increase in the total cost. So that's another advantage, especially in these times, to have models where you can break out suppliers' profits and overheads away from the direct costs, because you can then focus on where things like increased overheads due to COVID would actually occur. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a handout. I'm not going to go through it, but it's basically everything I've talked about, how to get modeling right, whether you're using a spreadsheet or whether you're using a utility like ProPurchasers. It's really how you do it. So you create the discussion piece, you run a first pass model. But the key things to remember is that, agreed to models make a great foundation for developing price setting formulas. They go on autopilot, and pricing becomes hassle-free. And as we'll talk about in a minute, once you've got a pricing model that's hassle-free, it allows you to go to the third cornerstone and start to actually change the way you do business with your suppliers. Next slide, please. Just quickly to summarize, a corrected model shows an even bigger picture, but it concludes your supplier's input, and most importantly, you both own the findings. And there are 5 good results. A mutually agreed to pricing mechanism prevents price creep, clearly good for the buyer. Suppliers' costs are always transparent, which is good for the buyer, and it also includes COVID effects, as we just saw. Suppliers' margins are protected, which is good for the seller. And price negotiations are in writing and therefore less confrontational, which is really good for both parties. The less time you spend hassling over price, the more time you have for more constructive things. And less confrontation offers an opportunity to build trust and cooperation. And trust and cooperation are critical if you want to start to build resilient supply chains with suppliers who are a lot closer than they used to be, because you've got, if you want to have your cake and eat it too, if you want to have a resilient supply chain and a low cost supply chain, you've got to figure out how to work closely with those suppliers and drive out costs. Next slide, please. So let's go on to the third cornerstone, converting sales reps into advocates. Next slide, please. Sales reps are your natural ally. I'm sure we all know that. They want to close and you want to buy. So the rep's compensation is usually tied to closing, not pricing. So if price is an obstacle, they'll be keen to remove it too. So how do you do that? Next slide, please. You show your sales rep the big picture. You supply them with the graphical data that arms them with compelling transparency argument to convince their superiors. You basically show them silent slopes, or you show them models where the price has gone down. Next slide, please. And when you show silent, when shown silent slopes, sorry, but slide before, senior management, it's interesting. So your sales rep takes your transparency data back. The silent slopes are pretty clear. What's their senior management, normally, senior management will take a long-term view and choose to bolster their company's reputation and improve their prospects for long-term success. Because clearly, let's look, that example with the Bolt going from 41 to 44 cents, on the upside, we played fair, we paid more as procurement professionals, and on the downside, clearly if they're going to charge more on the upside, they need to reduce it if they want to be fair. If they don't want to appear greedy and hypocritical, then they're going to play fair. And if they want their reputation to remain intact and they want to improve their prospects for long-term success, which is the real job of senior management, is the long-term success of a company, then they're going to respond positively to silent slopes. Next slide, please. So how to arm your sales rep? You send your sales rep an email with the appropriate graph or search cost model attached. You ask a simple question, please explain why you're requesting an increase when your input costs are clearly lower. The email should be straightforward and non-personal, so your sales rep can just forward it to superiors. Remember, your sales rep's already on board usually. You're almost writing this to the sales rep's boss or the boss's boss. You want this to go, it's going to be read by senior management, so write it as if that were happening. Next slide, please. Here's a quick example at a pro purchaser to show how it works. Please help me understand why you're asking for increase when your costs are clearly down. Thank you. And here's the electric motor cost that we showed before. Next slide, please. And that's kind of, if we'll talk, we won't talk about this now, but there's actually other webinars on this. Sometimes suppliers will not respond, and they're often the case when they're monopolies, or they've got a hook into your company. Maybe they've convinced someone in engineering or some other department that they're indispensable, so they don't have to worry about behaving properly when they're shown silent slopes. But 9 out of 10 times the silent slope will work, and you'll be able to not only have lower prices, but also retain the relationship. It becomes a non-confrontational, cooperative relationship that protects the supplier's margins and also gives you the prices you need, which sets us up for kind of the jewel in the crown, which is working on joint projects with select suppliers to create competitive advantage. This is how you can have your good pricing, have your resilient supply chain, and also have suppliers who will help you drive down the costs. Next slide, please. So taking supplier relations to the next level, we call it going fishing with suppliers. There's a whole bunch of fish here. Each one's a savings opportunity. Some of them are big, some of them are small. I had a boss once that said fish where the big fish are. So what we're going to do is find the biggest savings opportunities with our suppliers. Next slide, please. This is interesting because as procurement professionals, we have to ask ourselves, where are we most likely to find the best cost savings ideas? And when you ask people, you get great, lots of, supplier rationalization, as Kelly was talking about, or full truckloads, or there are lots of ways to work with suppliers to reduce costs, but that's not, in my experience, where the biggest fish are. Next slide, please. The biggest fish, in my experience, are actually the ideas that are found in your suppliers' organizations. It's the experience and knowledge inside the heads of their managers, their engineers, their operations, and their planning staff. Those are the big fish, are the ideas that are actually in your suppliers' organizations. Next slide, please. There's a quick story. I'm going to do this in 90 seconds. We're running out of time, but this is when I worked for Ball Packaging. We make paint cans. This is in the early 90s. This is when NAFTA first hit, and we were selling the paint can for $1.20. Here in Canada, we're Toronto-based, and as soon as the tariffs were eliminated in 1991 or 92, our American competition dropped the price to 88 cents. Well, that was crazy. I mean, we paid 90 cents for the steel, so we knew what to do. We went to the Canadian government, we complained. our competition, they're dumping. They're not allowed to sell it for 88 cents. It costs 90 cents for the steel. You can't sell something for less than it cost you. Well, we surprised. We were mortified to find out that it wasn't true. In fact, these paint cans did sell for 88 cents, and our U.S. competition was making a profit. Next slide, please. So I went to my boss, and I said, my boss called me into the office. Actually, I don't think I went to the boss. They said, look, we're going Chapter 11. We can't, we have to match the price. So we did. We matched the price at 88 cents, and we went to the supplier and said, look, we're out of business. We're going Chapter 11. 3 months we've got. That's what management says. And the supplier said, oh, well, I'm not surprised. I said, what do you mean you're not surprised? He says, well, I kind of know how they do it for 88 cents. I said, how? He said, well, they buy secondary steel. They don't buy prime steel. It turns out that about 6% of all steel that's made by steel mills isn't prime, it's secondary, and they sell it for half price to service centers because they want to get it out of the market. And there are about 14 reasons why steel can be, secondary. It could be a stain when they annealed it. It could be a tiny little inclusion, a speck. But what our competition US had figured out was that some of these specs, like a stained, piece of steel, is quite suitable for a paint can. Like you're covering it with a label anyway. So they had convinced their steel mills to sell them secondary steel at half price. So instead of 800 a ton, it was 400. And they've been doing that for 2 or 3 years. And no wonder they could sell the can for 88 cents and still make a profit. So long story short, our supplier agreed to do the same thing. We started buying secondary steels, not all the steel, just some of it. And we were able to make a can for 88 cents and sell it and make a profit. In fact, we became so good at making paint cans that we made 3 acquisitions within the next 3 years and became one of the leading dominant paint can suppliers in North America. So, why do you want to work with suppliers? Because suppliers know a lot. They know a lot about the outside world, like our steel supplier knew how our American counterparts were doing it. And they have deep technical knowledge about their own products. They knew all about secondaries. Not only that, they knew which ones would work on paint cans and which ones wouldn't. So that's where the big wins are, working with suppliers and finding these big fish. Next slide, please. So you work with your sales rep to open the door and expand the breadth of relationship. You've got this relationship now. That's what you did when you forged a relationship on the third cornerstone, is you developed a collegial relationship with your sales rep, and they will willingly, they'll be very keen to open the door because relationships are important. They know that, and by broadening a relationship between your company and his or her company, they're going to be keen to do that because it'll strengthen the relationship for both companies. Next slide, please. So big picture procurement works on 3 levels. Just summarizing now, buyers can easily spot silent slopes and prevent price creep that we talked about looking back in time. Sellers also realize that dealing fairly with silent slopes bolsters their reputation, improves their prospects for future success. So they're looking forward. And the third way it works is by both of them, by embracing the entire supply chain and working cooperatively on joint projects, can make improvements to their mutual benefit. Next slide, please. So big picture procurement is all about forging long-term give and take relationships that align goals for mutual benefit. Next slide. It's about simultaneously achieving cost containment and resilience. So you're containing the costs by using transparency, and then you're working together on these joint projects, and you've got resilience because you're very tight with your supplier. You understand their operations, they understand yours. So when there is a problem, an unforeseen problem, whether it's a pandemic or whether it's a hurricane, it really doesn't matter. You're going to be a preferred customer and they're going to be a preferred supplier. So doing this is not only good for you, it's good for your supplier, and it's good for the long-term predictability and resilience of your supply chain. Next slide, please. So it's, big picture procurement is all about building rock solid supply chains that in the end create long-term competitive advantage. Next slide, please. And that's the end of the formal part of the presentation. Thank you for attending. Kelly and I have put our email addresses up on this slide. So if you have any questions now or down the road, please feel free to email either of us and we'll get back to you. Now it's time to We've got 2 or 3 polling questions. We'd love your input. Next slide, please. Well, just before we go, I quickly went through cost transparency. You see, people have often asked about big picture procurement, how it works. There are 6 webinars involved. They're easy to access. I'll explain to you how to do it later. This number 2 on cost transparency digs much deeper into this whole cost transparency phenomenon, those 4 cornerstones I talked about. And webinar number 4, collaborating and innovating with suppliers, goes into much more detail about how to actually spot and manage projects like this. So if you're interested in taking it to the next level, you're more than welcome to do so through our complimentary webinars. Next slide, please. Now it's time for your feedback. We have 3 polling questions. I wonder if you could, Amanda, launch the polling questions, please.
This is Scott Rod. I'm gonna launch these now. I showed two polling questions is what I have access to.
Yes,
right?
Sorry. I think you're
Not
right.
a problem. First poll question. Did you find this webinar a good use of your time? And we have a couple questions we're gonna get to momentarily and pose to Rod and Kelly, but if y'all could vote now, and we'll give that. Rod, how long do you want to give it? 30 seconds or so?
Not even, another 5 people. It's only yes or no. Usually people are very quick to answer this. The next one's going to be trickier though.
Okay, all right. I'm going to close this one down now. And let's pose a second question here. And Rod, I'll let you take this one.
Well, if you'd like to know more about ProPurchaser, or perhaps you're interested in a complimentary 30-day trial, our trials don't require credit cards. There's absolutely no obligation. If you are, we'd be happy to help you out. If you click yes to the first box, you can get trial information. If you're not interested in a trial, but just more information, please click the second box. Of course, if you're not, or you can click 3 or 4 if you're interested, and we'll follow up by email to fulfill your request.
All right, I'll give this another 5 seconds, and then we'll close this one here. All right. So Rod and Kelly, are y'all ready to take a couple of questions from the audience?
Yes, sure.
Okay. All right. So first question comes from Pierre. And this is a good question, but actually we've got a couple strong questions here. So Pierre, great to have you here on the webinar. We've enjoyed your live stream participation as well. All right, so Pierre says, I agree with the reshoring not solving all of the issues, but is this a focused approach to offset the extended supply chain risk by creating or developing the secondary source regionally? And Kelly, this kind of goes back to your front end comments on reshoring.
Sure. So I guess what I would say is it's certainly a valid alternative, right, to the longer extended supply chains, is bringing things back here. It does need to be a strategic decision, right? So we had talked about some of the low cost sourcing. It's very important to not flip and say, I'm going to do high cost local sourcing. And so what it comes down to is it's a big picture decision to make the choice to reshore. If the increased security or the shortened shipping time that you get by bringing something back and sourcing domestically is worth whatever incremental cost you have to bear, especially if it's a direct material and you know you're having to pass that along, it may also have value proposition to your customers, right? That you can say, hey, look at what we're doing to make our supply chain more predictable and secure. But it's a matter of never reshoring for the sake of reshoring, always understanding the strategic, the cost, the risk implications of that choice, and making sure that you can justify it in your total cost model.
Outstanding.
I agree with you. Yeah, just to add to what Kelly said, I think the other thing I learned in my career was that you may pay, let's say, 10% more, just for the sake of a number, to reshore in the short run, but you'd be surprised. I was always surprised at how we could shrink that. If you work constructively with the right kind of preferred suppliers, and you say going in, look, we're paying $1.10 now, and we need to pay $1 to make it competitive. Let's have a goal together in 3 years or 2 years to get it down to $1. Honda used to give contracts like that, right? It was called the Honda 4% contract, where they give you the contract on the promise that you would reduce the price 4% for the life of the contract each year, and it worked. And so it's possible if you're patient, I think, to have your cake and eat it too. Yes, Kelly's right. You don't want to add costs permanently to your supply chain because you could, your competition won't do that. You go to business, but you may be pleasantly surprised especially if you put it on the table at first, how you can drive that down so that you can actually have the $1 part and the local secure supply at the same time.
Good stuff there.
A great question.
Absolutely. Well, we've got another question here about reshoring. It's an intriguing topic here in 2020 in particular. And one of the things we talk about a lot, Kelly and Rod, is as much as a consumer globally has learned about supply chain here in recent months, I'm really curious to see how many consumers take that next leap and really understand why so many supply chains are global in nature. So we'll see. We'll keep our finger on the pulse there. Next question, Kelly, this one's posed to you. This is from Retree. Kelly, are there any new action plans that we need to implement for the purpose of risk management in this new normal supply chain? That's the first question. Do you believe that reshoring would be implemented by USA and Europe despite of its high cost? I'll stop there. There's one more question that Retree added, but what's your take on those first two?
So I think the first part about action plans, it's a little bit hard right now because things are recovering and beginning to stabilize. But I don't feel like, if you've done a lot of reading in the area of supply chain, people will often talk about visibility horizons, right? How far into the future can you see with an appropriate level of certainty to make longer term decisions? And my sense is that we're not totally there yet to where we can actually be putting newly developed frameworks in place that incorporate the new risks associated with the pandemic. It doesn't mean that we can't go to a very short iterative, maybe a 14-day, maybe a 21 or 28-day, right, type of planning framework where you have frequently recurring adjustment points that come up. But I think right now, both regulatorily and cost and supply chain disruption, all of those things are really preventing us from saying, oh, this is, everyone hates the new normal. Oh, this is the new normal, and so this is going to be our new framework. And then in terms of reshoring being global, this actually is perfect. Thank you so much for asking this question, because it brings me back to one of the things that I missed. And that's what you hear about a lot, which is sort of the China plus one strategy. And so I think, it's one thing to be emotional and say, okay, that's it. We're all done with long supply chains. We're all done with global supply chains. We're all done with China. But the reality, once the initial knee-jerk reaction wears off, is that it's much harder to sustainably move away from global extended supply chains that may or may not involve China completely. And instead, what I think you're going to see is supply chains in different parts of the world sort of cherry picking their own favorite alternate, secondary, or complementary source to materials coming from China. And that goes back to that optimization. It's going to be a different decision if you're in Eastern Europe versus Western Europe versus North America, and precisely what you're buying and what materials it's made of, to go back to Rod's point about what are the things actually driving cost and where do you have the opportunity to contain. So Rod, I don't know if you have anything you wanted to add to that, but that's sort of my 2 cents on the frameworks versus cost containment reshoring.
Rod, is there anything else you'd like to add there before we move to this next question? And you may be on mute.
Thank you. I muted myself so I wouldn't, sorry about that. No, I thought Kelly did a great job. There's not much you can add. I think, I talked to a member who was reshoring from China. She said that she had 3 items, 2 of them had some materials and labor, and she could find supplies in North America, suppliers in North America who were within 10 or 15%, and she was going to work on those. Circuit boards, she says, I can't find anybody even close. And so she was stuck with China for circuit boards, but she wasn't stuck for the other two items. So to Kelly's point, yeah, you're strategic. You pick and choose what you can do. You don't always get what you want, but you can probably get what you need if you think about how these things are made and think selectively about what really goes into things. Circuit boards are lots of intense, high-skilled labor, and China is probably the best place in the world for that. But if it isn't that, if it's material heavy, or there's labor that isn't so high skilled, you can probably find it in North America for a similar price.
All right. Great question. Thanks so much. And we're going to take one more. I apologize. We're not going to get to everybody's comments and questions. We're over a few minutes here. Kelly and Rod, thanks for your time. All right. So Rod, this final question from Sophia is posed to you. And the question is this: Rod, performing price modeling to identify cost drivers, understand your price fluctuations, and avoid price creep is perceived as a very demanding task in many companies. To be able to implement this for the first time, do you recommend performing it only on key products or components?
Good, really good question, Sophia. Yeah, a lot of people think you've got to be, a mathematician and engineer combined to build a model. And there are some models that are like that, zero-based models, but not relative modeling. So if you're trying to figure out what something should cost you today versus what it cost you at a point in time in the past, say a year ago, last time you negotiated. So again, it was $1. You want to know, should it be $1.05 or 95 cents? That's a lot easier and a lot less time consuming than trying to figure out, should it have been $1 in the first place? Because you got to model every little bit. So yeah, to answer your question, I would choose something where you could easily identify the components and what goes into it. Whether it's a high dollar purchase or not, it probably doesn't matter. Your first model, you just want to practice and get it right. So maybe it's even better that it's a B or C item, and just you can practice on it. And then remember that you don't get it right the first time, and that it's a discussion piece, and you put down what you can with your estimates of what percentage of the cost is, and you ask your supplier for their input. You don't even say, hey, I want to pay you this amount. This is what I think. What do you all think? And then it's when they come back and you start talking about their costs that you learn a ton, and you get to adjust the model. And sometimes models go back 2 and 3 and 4 times before they're right. And then once you've done it once, then maybe you move on to something a little more difficult to do, maybe more components to it, or maybe it's a higher dollar item. But everyone who, even people who aren't good at math, even people who don't think like engineers, it's amazing how many of those people, once they've done a model once or twice and realize that it's an iterative thing, it's a back and forth thing, how easy that becomes. But the trick is, it's a comparative model. You're not building it from scratch. It's not a zero-based model. It's I used to pay $1. What should I pay today? And if you look at it that way, it's not nearly as difficult to build a model as you think, and they're very, very useful.
Outstanding. Kelly, any quick piggyback comment on that?
No, I don't think so. Well done, Rod.
Outstanding. Well, Stefan and Janine and Sylvia and David and many others, sorry we couldn't get to your comments and questions. We'll make sure we pass all of them over to Rod and to Kelly. And by the way, Rod, Sylvia Judy, who is our resident jam maker here at Supply Chain Now, says she does use Ball Mason jars for her jam. So a little shout out to your former organization. Sylvia, hope this finds you well. All right, so to everyone, thanks so much for joining us here today. Big thanks to Kelly Barner with Buyers Meeting Point, and big thanks to Rod Shurkin with ProPurchaser.com. Would welcome our audience to reach out and also connect with them on social media. In particular, if you're a big Twitter fan, Buyers Meeting Point is a great account to follow and connect and interact with. So on that note, thanks for joining us, listeners. Hey, be sure to check out a wide variety of industry thought leadership at supplychainradio.com. Hey, find us and subscribe wherever you get your podcast from, including some of our new shows, Tequila Sunrise, Supply Chain is Boring, which is a controversially entitled show led by Chris Barnes, a lot of other stuff. With that said, on behalf of the entire team here at Supply Chain Now, Scott Luton wishing all of our listeners nothing but the best. Do good, give forward, be the change that's needed. And on that note, we'll see you next time here on Supply Chain Now. Thanks, everybody.